I think Mexico is largely run by the cartels, and that's a sad thing to say. And if they wanted help with that, we'd give them help. But Mexico, if you look at what's gone on with Mexico for years now, but now especially, it's run by the cartels.
Cartel hitmen strapped GoPro cameras to their tactical vests, walked into a family-owned taco shop, and executed a 25-year-old journalist on film. They communicated over radio frequencies like a military operation, fired over 30 rounds into his body, and walked out without covering their faces. They didn't need to. But here is the catch.
Tonight, more bloodshed in Mexico. Another journalist killed this week in the country. 5 reporters have now been killed there less than 2 months into the new year. Sinclair Asamoah takes us to Oaxaca, where public outrage is growing and journalists are demanding protections.
This murder was so brazen, so meticulously documented by the killers themselves, that it forced the United States and Mexico into an unprecedented emergency security alliance and exposed a truth that powerful people have buried for decades. Mexico has become the deadliest country in the Western Hemisphere for telling the truth, and the killing is only accelerating. The last shift, 7 o'clock in the evening, January 8th, 2026. The sun had already dipped below the horizon in Cazones, a working-class neighborhood in Veracruz, Mexico. Inside Trogebeer, a small family-owned taco shop, 25-year-old Carlos Castro stood behind the counter, doing what he did every single night: taking orders, greeting regulars, scrolling through his phone between customers, managing his Facebook news page while the smell of grilled meat and fresh tortillas filled the air. He had no idea that outside, in the gathering darkness, armed men were circling the block. They had been watching him for weeks, tracking his movements, memorizing his schedule. And tonight, they had come to deliver a message that would echo across international headlines. 35 seconds of leaked footage would later show the assassination squad communicating over radio frequencies, coordinating their approach like a professional military unit. They knew exactly where Carlos was standing. They knew he would be alone behind that counter. They knew that in Veracruz, they could murder a journalist in broad view of terrified customers and walk away without consequence.
We begin then in Mexico, in the state of Veracruz. It is said to be the most dangerous place for journalists across the American continent. Last Friday, a photojournalist who'd worked there was assassinated, the 14th, in fact, in just 5 years.
Witnesses say multiple armed men entered the restaurant without hesitation. They didn't wear masks. They didn't try to hide their faces. Why would they? In Veracruz, cartel hitmen operate with the casual confidence of men who know they will never face justice. Over 30 bullets tore through Carlos Castro's body, while terrified customers hit the floor, praying they wouldn't be next. The killers walked out as calmly as they had walked in. His family's restaurant, the place where Carlos had grown up helping his parents, where he had laughed and worked and dreamed of a future, became a crime scene soaked in his blood. He was pronounced dead at the scene. 25 years old, murdered for the crime of telling the truth. But this nightmare was only beginning. Because what happened in the days that followed would reveal just how far the cartels were willing to go to send their message, and just how broken the systems meant to stop them had become. The boy who posted too much. To understand why Carlos Castro was murdered, you need to understand what he represented. Because Carlos wasn't some investigative journalist working for a major newspaper. He wasn't a television correspondent with a security team and a legal department backing him up. He was a 25-year-old kid running a Facebook page from his family's taco shop. The page was called Código Norte Veracruz. It covered crime news, security alerts, and local violence in northern Veracruz state. Nothing fancy, no deep investigative pieces. Just a young man with a phone and an internet connection documenting what was happening in his community. But for the cartels, even this was too much. See, in Mexico, you don't need to work for the New York Times to get killed. You don't need to be publishing Pulitzer-worthy exposés or bringing down corrupt politicians. You just need to post the wrong thing about the wrong people. A photo of a crime scene they wanted hidden. A report on police corruption they wanted buried. A simple acknowledgement that violence was happening in areas they wanted the world to believe were under control. Carlos had been doing exactly that for months. He reported on cartel activity when other local outlets stayed silent. He covered police corruption when everyone else looked away. He exposed violence that local authorities desperately wanted forgotten, and the cartels noticed. In the months before his murder, the death threats began arriving. The messages were direct, brutal, unmistakable. Stop reporting or die. Carlos did what any reasonable person would do, but here is the catch. He reported the threats to authorities. He requested protection. He begged someone, anyone, to take the danger seriously. And nothing happened. No protection was assigned. No investigation was launched. His pleas disappeared into the same bureaucratic void that had swallowed hundreds of similar requests before. Carlos Castro was on his own. And on January 8th, that isolation cost him everything. The vanishing, the funeral for Carlos Castro, drew mourners from across the region. Friends, family members, fellow journalists who understood all too well that they could be next. The ceremony ended around 3 in the afternoon. Most attendees left shortly after, returning to their homes and their own fragile sense of safety. Wendy, Carlos's 23-year-old girlfriend, and her best friend Kareem stayed behind. They lingered at the cemetery with a small group of friends, processing the impossible grief of burying someone taken so violently, so young. They were last seen leaving the cemetery together around 5 in the evening, walking toward the parking area. But here is the catch. 48 hours after Carlos was buried, both women had completely vanished. Their phones went silent. No calls, no messages, no social media activity, nothing. Their families tried desperately to reach them, cycling through calls that rang endlessly before going to voicemail. Hours passed. Then, in the middle of the night, both families received identical text messages from the missing women's phones. We're in Tuxpan, a city approximately 60 miles away, notorious for cartel violence and mass graves. A place neither woman had any reason to visit, especially not in the middle of the night, especially not hours after burying their murdered loved one. Days passed, then a week, then 2. The governor confirmed investigations were underway, but offered no leads. The Attorney General's office released a statement claiming there was no confirmed connection between the disappearances and Carlos's execution. Nobody believed that lie for a second. The timing was surgical. 2 women intimately connected to a murdered journalist, vanishing within 48 hours of his funeral, their phones sending cryptic messages claiming they were in a cartel-controlled city known for making people disappear permanently. This wasn't coincidence. This was a message. A brutal reminder that in Veracruz, the cartels don't just eliminate their targets, they eliminate everyone connected to them. As of this recording, Wendy and Kareem have never been found. If these patterns of impunity disturb you, smash that like button and subscribe. We expose what powerful people want buried. The graveyard state. To understand why Veracruz has become ground zero for this crisis, you need to understand what the cartels are really fighting for. This isn't just about drugs. It's about geography, logistics, and billions of dollars in annual revenue. Veracruz sits on the Gulf of Mexico with major port access, making it one of the most strategically vital corridors for drug trafficking routes into the United States. Multiple cartels are fighting for control of this territory, and the violence isn't just gang-on-gang warfare anymore. It's total territorial domination, where civilians, journalists, and anyone who threatens information control becomes a legitimate target. But here is the catch. The cartels don't just control drug routes in Veracruz. They control the government itself. Local officials are either on cartel payrolls or they're dead. Police forces work directly for trafficking organizations, providing security for shipments and eliminating anyone who threatens operations. Municipal governments launder cartel money through public contracts. It's a shadow government where criminal organizations make the real decisions, and elected officials are simply puppets reading scripts written by men who will never face a ballot or a courtroom. For journalists, this creates an impossible situation. How do you report on corruption when the mayor taking bribes also controls the police who are supposed to protect you? How do you expose cartel violence when cartel members are literally sitting inside state government offices, reviewing the same reports that are supposed to bring them down? You can't. So most journalists in Veracruz practice what's called autocensura, self-censorship.
One of the main consequences of the impunity is that journalists start censoring themselves. They stop reporting on organized crime, they stop reporting on corruption, and as a result, entire areas in Mexico basically have no serious journalistic coverage or investigative journalism going on.
They don't report cartel news. They don't investigate corruption. They don't ask dangerous questions. Because the ones who do end up like Carlos Castro, bleeding out on the floor, while their killers walk away without consequence. Since 2000, at least 32 journalists have been murdered in Veracruz alone. 32 people whose only crime was doing their job. And here's the statistic that should keep you awake tonight. More than 90% of all crimes against journalists in Mexico never reach a verdict in a court of law. The message is unmistakable. Kill a journalist in Veracruz, and you will probably get away with it. The cartels know it. The corrupt officials know it. And most terrifying of all, the journalists know it too. That's why Carlos Castro's murder hit differently. Because this time, the killers were so confident, so absolutely certain of their impunity, that they literally recorded themselves doing it. And nobody stopped them. The Emergency Alliance. 3 days after Carlos Castro's body was found, something unprecedented happened. The United States and Mexico released a joint statement announcing a new security cooperation framework specifically targeting cartel violence against journalists and press freedom. Now, you might be thinking, haven't we heard this before? Haven't we seen these promises 1,000 times? Empty declarations followed by nothing while bodies keep piling up? Yes, but this time, the circumstances are different. President Claudia Sheinbaum, who took office in October 2024, has been under massive international pressure over journalist killings. Human rights organizations have been screaming about Mexico's press freedom crisis for years, but most governments found it convenient to look away. Then Carlos Castro was murdered on camera by cartel hitmen who coordinated the assassination over radio frequencies, like they were placing a delivery order. And suddenly, the world couldn't ignore it anymore. The joint U.S.-Mexico statement is only happening because the situation has become so catastrophically bad that pretending otherwise is no longer politically viable. Carlos Castro himself had requested protection before he was killed. His requests were ignored or buried in bureaucracy until it was too late. So yes, the United States and Mexico are finally working together, but the question everyone is asking remains unanswered. Is this genuine change, or is this just damage control after international embarrassment? The killing fields. Let's zoom out and look at the bigger nightmare that Carlos Castro's murder represents, because his death wasn't an isolated tragedy. It was the latest data point in a pattern that has been accelerating for decades. Since 2000, at least 162 journalists have been murdered in Mexico. 162. That's not a statistic. That's a mass grave of people whose only crime was doing their job. Mothers and fathers who never came home. Sons and daughters buried by parents who will never recover. Communities left without the people who were supposed to tell their stories. Under President López Obrador's administration, from 2018 to 2024, at least 54 journalists were killed. 54 in 6 years, making his government the deadliest 6-year term for press freedom in modern Mexican history. Every few weeks, another name was added to the list. Another family was destroyed. Another community learned that speaking truth to power carries a death sentence. Now Scheinbaum has inherited this crisis. But here is the catch. Her first 3 months show the killing rate is accelerating, not slowing down. Under Scheinbaum's first 100 days in office, 11 journalists have already been killed in Mexico. 11 in 3 months. That's 1 journalist murdered every 9 days on average. And those are just the confirmed murders. That number doesn't include the dozens of journalists who have been kidnapped, beaten, threatened, or forced into exile. It doesn't count the hundreds practicing self-censorship because they're too terrified to report the truth. Mexico is now the deadliest country in the Western Hemisphere for journalists, more dangerous than any active war zone in the Americas. More dangerous than countries we typically associate with press oppression.
The Committee to Protect Journalists says widespread impunity allows criminal gangs, corrupt officials and cartels to silence their critics. The Mexican government has repeatedly promised to protect journalists and freedom of expression.
Reporters Without Borders ranks Mexico 141st out of 180 countries for press freedom. Worse than Russia. Worse than Iraq. Worse than most authoritarian dictatorships that don't even pretend to be democracies. Entire regions of Mexico now exist in what press freedom organizations call information blackouts. Areas where no journalists dare report because they know it's a death sentence. Where citizens get their news from cartel-approved sources, or they get nothing at all. Where truth has become a luxury that only the brave can afford. And most can't afford to be brave when bravery costs you your life. The price of silence. Carlos Castro was 25 years old. He ran a Facebook page. He worked at his family's taco shop. He loved a woman named Wendy, who may now be buried in an unmarked grave somewhere in cartel territory. He was not a hero seeking martyrdom. He was a young man who believed that his community deserved to know what was happening in their own streets, and for that belief, he was executed on camera, while the people who should have protected him did nothing. But here's what the cartels don't understand about martyrdom. They can kill journalists. They can terrorize families. They can create information blackouts across entire regions, but they cannot kill the truth forever. Every journalist they murder creates a story that spreads further than any Facebook post ever could. Every execution video they record becomes evidence of their barbarity that circulates across international networks. Every Wendy and Kareem who vanishes becomes a symbol of the horror they're trying to hide. Carlos Castro's death has forced the United States and Mexico into an emergency alliance. It has put Veracruz under international scrutiny. It has made the names of cartel leaders synonymous with press oppression in human rights reports that will outlive every single one of them. Is this new security cooperation going to actually protect journalists? Or is it just another empty promise that will fade from headlines while bodies keep piling up in the streets of Veracruz? The honest answer is that nobody knows. The mechanisms of protection have failed so many times that hope feels naive. The institutional corruption runs so deep that reform seems impossible. But somewhere in Mexico right now, another 25-year-old is running a news page from their phone. Another young journalist is documenting cartel violence that authorities want buried. Another truth teller is deciding whether to post or stay silent. And the cartels are watching. Carlos Castro didn't die because he was reckless or naive. He died because he believed that truth matters, that his community deserved information, that silence in the face of violence is its own form of complicity. He was right about all of it, and that's exactly why they killed him. The question now isn't whether more journalists will die. They will. The question is whether the world will finally care enough to stop it. Whether the emergency alliance between two governments will translate into actual protection for the people risking everything to tell the truth. Whether the names on that growing death list will become symbols that inspire change or simply statistics that fade into the same bureaucratic void that swallowed Carlos Castro's pleas for help. If you want to understand what's really happening in the places the news won't cover, hit subscribe. We dig into these stories every week. And trust me, you don't want to miss what we find next. 162 journalists murdered since 2000. 90% of those cases never reaching a verdict. A new name added to the list every 9 days under the current administration. The clock is already ticking toward the next one.